This is a question for Dan. His visual model, his three-part visual model of reason, law, and instinct. Are you saying, it seems like instinct, there are two parts of that, the survival instinct, catching the baby instinct, then about, I don't know if you're including the instinct of reciprocity, sort of evolved group selection, morality. Is that part of the instinct process you're using, or are you leaving that part out of the equation?
No, because we also have altruism and empathy circuits, yeah. Unless you're a psychopath, those things function. They're all part of that picture. Whatever instincts that our minds and our brains have that we inherited from our ancestors play into survivability. And I think mere morality is surviving. We can go beyond that, but yeah. In fact, I understand that when you do an act of kindness, there's actually a drug kick to the brain that comes from that. When you hold the door open for somebody behind you, why do you do that? You don't know those people. They might be Republicans, you know? I mean, and when you hold the door open, I'm sorry, I'm sure there's Republicans here. I don't mean that. Our group has Republicans in it. There's some great Republican atheists and all that. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, but when you hold the door open, you don't say, okay, buddy, you got to do that for me next time, right? It's not reciprocal altruism. There's just an altruism that we have. So we're social animals, and we evolved to be social animals. And so we're trying to protect our genes and the genes of our children and of our nieces and nephews and of our neighbors. And by extension, I think of all of our cousins on the entire planet, even the jellyfish. If we could breed with the jellyfish.
No bones.
Question is for Dr. Hafer. When I talk about evolution with people who are skeptical of it, as you mentioned, one of the most difficult parts for people to understand is how speciation happened, especially sea animals to land animals. The best way I've heard anyone articulate that confusion is like this. At some point on Earth, there were no animals with legs. And then at some point after that, there were animals with legs, which means that at some point an animal without legs gave birth to an animal with legs to some extent. I have trouble articulating how that kind of speciation occurs. Could you help me with that?
Well, there's a couple of different things to talk about here, and I'm not actually the best person to talk about it. There's front legs and back legs. Front legs, like the mud skipper has, have actually, you can see them a lot in fish. In fact, there's a really fun video that you can Google called Fish Feet. It's a YouTube. And it shows not just mud skippers, but all kinds of different fish, usually shallow water fish that tend to live on the bottom of shallow water. It turns out that if you're kind of neutrally buoyant, having feet that dig into the bottom of the sand is actually a pretty good way to propel yourself, easier than swimming. So there are quite a few fish that have feet. The thing which is a little bit trickier, or less usual, I should say, is the evolution of hind limbs. And that's the whole great story of Tiktaalik, of figuring out where along the lines there were some fish that started developing hind limbs. But I'm going to give you a kicker that most people totally forget about, but which I think is incredibly important, which is that vertebrates were not the first land animals. There were already arthropods, insects and spiders and things like that. They were already on land far before vertebrates got there. So the point is, legged animals walking out of the sea and onto land happened many times, and many times prior to when fish started working on walking out of the water. So there were already land animals. If you look at a crab, there's an animal that can live in the ocean, or very similar crabs that live on land. You've probably seen them scuttling along beaches. They're land animals too. So I mean, there's a case of legs started in the water, went to the land, no problem. Does that make sense?
This question is for Dan. Dan, can you give us an update on some FFRF legal cases that you have going on right now?
Yeah. You mentioned Tiktaalik. Maybe some people don't know what Tiktaalik, that fossil. Briefly explain what Tiktaalik.
Okay, this is actually a very cool thing that was done very briefly and very simply. It's just that in trying to trace vertebrate evolution as vertebrates went onto land, there was this moment when hind limbs were being developed, or were developing, I should say, and we didn't have much in the way of fossil record there, but various people, including fish biologists and other people, kind of got together and said, well, when did this happen, do we think, and where did it happen, and how long ago was it, and where would we find a fossil like this? And they kind of sort of figured out where that event ought to have taken place and at what time. And then they set out on expeditions looking for rocks of that age, sedimentary rocks of that age and so on, looking for fossils. And sure enough, they came upon a fossil fish with legs. Getting there, getting started, and they named it Tiktaalik, and I forget what Tiktaalik means. But as I said, there was a fossil that was basically a gutsy prediction that they made that they would be able to find this, and there it was. So it's pretty cool, and it is another case of one of the things that science has to be able to do is, in principle, you ought to be willing to make predictions and then test them, and that was what they did.
We had Neil Shubin on our radio show about your inner fish, a great story. But talking about morality, the United States of America decided to avoid the religious conflict that happened in all the colonies and in Europe, and wrote a constitution, the first constitution in history to separate religion and government, to have state-church separation. The Freedom from Religion Foundation honors that principle. It's served us well to keep religion and government separate. And not only are we the largest organization of freethinkers in the country, with more than 20,000 now, but we've taken the lead in legal action specifically for the First Amendment Establishment Clause. We have about 14 cases in the courts right now, actually 13. We just found out yesterday that the city of Pismo Beach, California, after we sued them for having prayer at their city council meeting, decided to capitulate, and we're getting a court order, so they can't go back and do it. They're going to stop prayer. They had an official chaplain in the city of Pismo Beach who was praying to Jesus and turning around and asking everybody else to join him in praying to Jesus and miracles. So our plaintiffs, and we sued, and we just had that victory. So I guess we have 13 cases, including 3 right now going after the IRS. And some of you know we had a great victory last fall. Federal Judge Barbara Crabb ruled in our favor on the parsonage allowance. Some of you may not know this, but the IRS gives clergy, ministers of the gospel, which, by the way, ministers of the gospel includes rabbis, anybody who's ordained, that don't have to report their housing as income. It drastically lowers their tax liability, and they pay less tax, and you and I have to pay more. So it's a long story, but we had a great victory out of that, and then the U.S. government has just decided, 2 weeks ago, they decided to appeal their loss. It was the Obama administration, so we're going to go to the 7th Circuit in Chicago, 7th Circuit, and continue the fight. They try to knock you down with standing. They try to say, you can't even get into court, but our standing is real strong in this case because the Freedom from Religion Foundation, like a church, is a nonprofit 501c3. When I was a minister of the gospel, working for a 501c3 organization that was promoting the concept of God, I got to take advantage of that break. Wouldn't you love that? Wouldn't you love to write off your house payment or your house, and also deduct the interest you're paying on your mortgage? That's double dipping. I got to claim that, but now that I'm working for a 501c3 organization that's challenging the concept of God, I don't get to take that. So the Freedom from Religion Foundation has designated a housing allowance for me and Annie Laurie as co-presidents it doesn't change anything, it's just on paper. And so we have a housing allowance that we don't get to claim, and so we are injured. We are injured parties, we're plaintiffs in the lawsuit, and the federal judge said, that's right, you have the standing to take a case, because we think all nonprofits should be treated the same. Who's to say that preachers are doing any better work than the American Red Cross or any other, charitable group? So that's gonna go to Chicago, and we get to argue it again. There's a Jesus statue in a federal park, federal forest in Montana. 10 Commandments monuments in front of high schools in Pennsylvania. We're suing the IRS over the electioneering. The pastors should get up to politic. In fact, our case has come to the forefront now because some churches have moved to intervene, and the federal judge has accepted their intervention because they want to politic from the pulpit. They want to test this law as well. So we've got the case now. This case has to go to the Supreme Court. It's going to take a few years, but asking the IRS to enforce its own rules to deny tax exemption to these churches that are illegally politicking from the pulpit. We're also suing the IRS over the 990 form. And the 990 form is how nonprofits are accountable to the public. The 990 shows all the money we make, what we spend. You can go online right now and you can see my salary. You can see everything that FFRF does. All nonprofits have to do that, but not churches. Churches don't have to be accountable. They don't have to report how much they take in or how much they spend on what. We don't think that's right. We think the bargain, if you're going to be a tax-exempt organization, is that you are accountable to the public for how you're using your money. So those are some of the cases we're taking. We just hired our 5th full-time attorney, Sam. He's really, not only are the attorneys happy to have a job and doing something they love, constitutional issues are really fun. It's a lot better than divorces and drunk driving and bankruptcies and all that. We're actually involved in really neat issues, and so we're expanding the building. The foundation is really crowded in Madison, Wisconsin in our building. So right now we're in the middle of a huge building expansion project where we're going to go four new floors over here and a 3rd floor above where we are. So that's just a quick overview of our attempts to keep religion and government separate, which is good. We think that's a moral principle. It minimizes harm. Look what happens when religion and government do mix. Look what has happened historically.
Hi, Dan Barker. I've got a question for you. Concerning the harm principle, as you mentioned in your mere morality chapter, would you incorporate or differentiate this from the basic utilitarian thought? And if so, could you go into detail?
Yeah, it looks like utilitarianism. It actually looks like negative utilitarianism. With utilitarianism, the greatest happiness for the greatest good, I think that's a great idea, but I don't think any of us in our daily lives are making those kind of calculations. How do I know what the greatest happiness for the greatest good? That would be more of an idea for a government. Governments could probably have a utilitarian principle. In my daily life and your daily life, I think the harm principle is simpler. It's a mere morality. And utilitarianism or negative utilitarianism, what is the greatest harm for the greatest number? Can any of us make that calculation? But we can, at least in our daily lives, attempt to resolve moral dilemmas as they come along. So it does look, but the harm principle does look like a negative utilitarianism. And it's consequentialist, obviously. I think morality has to be consequentialist. That your actions have consequences. And you're going to, if you have any choice in that, whatever your view of free will is, if you have any choice in that, that's what it means to be moral. You're making a decision that's going to result in some kind of consequences. And to be moral, I think, means that you're trying to minimize the actual real harm in the real world. So I respect Jeremy Bentham and all them, but I think that goes beyond mere morality. I think mere morality is a floor that we can all get through our lives, in a practical sense.
I have a question for Mr. Barker. So if mere morality means, causing less harm in the world, why is that morality authoritative over everyone? Did it come from a universal standard? And If so, why do you object to a universal standard of God's law?
Well, it's not a universal standard. Morality is relative. For example, our species happen to evolve to need water. The value of water is just hydrogen and oxygen, hydrogen molecules and oxygen molecules. But our species requires water for survival. So relative to our desire to survive, water is valuable. It's a good thing. We did not evolve to require arsenic. Do we need any trace arsenic in our bodies? Does anybody know that? I don't think we do. All right. So if I were to offer you this water, that would be a good thing. It would be a valuable. If I were to offer you some arsenic, that would not be good relative to our species. I suppose a species might evolve that would require arsenic, in which case arsenic would be a valuable thing. So relative to who we are, by nature, a living organism wants to continue living. By nature, we recoil from harm. You don't think about that. I don't deliberate when I take my hand away from the fire. That's a natural thing, because if you don't recoil naturally from harm, then your organism's not going to survive long enough to reproduce, at least. So it's not an absolute moral thing. The conclusions that we make in our daily lives are not objective moral values. What they are is they are values that can be objectively justified by referring to the real world. So in some cases, telling a lie is wrong, and in some cases, telling a lie is the right thing. It's not an absolute. A woman knocks on your door in the middle of the night, and she's crying, and she's bruised, and she's bleeding. She says, "My husband is trying to kill me. Please, I need somewhere to hide." And so you bring her in, and you help her out, and you give her a place to stay. Later that night, her husband comes banging on the door and says, "Do you know where my wife is?" What do? Do you say, "Oh, I should never tell a lie. I'm going to be a good moral person"? The moral thing to do in that case is to lie to that man. Lying would be a good thing to do. You can't make a general rule that it's always wrong to tell a lie. Even in the Bible, lying was praised. Rahab was deceived during wartime, and the lie was actually considered a good thing. So it's not so much an authoritative command, it's just a definition of what life is. Life, by definition, wants to preserve itself. So that's not coming from outside of life. It's just a definition. It's a descriptive rule, I guess, if we wish to survive. If you're not mentally healthy and you don't value your life, then you're not going to think in the same way. But fortunately, most of us fall somewhere in the mental health curve in here, and we do value our life and the lives of others who share genetics like ours to some degree. So I wouldn't call the harm principle an authoritative rule.
I'd like to hear from both of you on this one, but my question is based on Dan Barker's presentation. How would you respond to someone who's just had the passing of a loved one? And would you respond differently if they were an atheist as well? I'm assuming your position. And then if they were religious of any particular variant, would your approach to how you interact with that person to express compassion be any different?
Well, yeah, we all have experience of people dying and of our friends having their loved ones dying. This is not that unusual an event. And, in general, being sympathetic is the right thing to do. And expressing that sympathy is the right thing to do. And things might become more complicated if they ask, well, do you think he's in heaven now? But frankly, I've never had that come up. There are many, many ways to comfort the bereaved that do not involve telling them stories about where that person is now. And those words are still very comforting. In fact, one minister I know said that the main thing that a minister does with the bereaved is be an unanxious presence. And to be an unanxious presence, you don't have to be talking about whether you think there's an afterlife or not.
My mom died 10 years ago, and she was a Sunday school teacher, but then later became an atheist. It was really fun. I wasn't trying to convert my parents to atheism. They did their own thinking. And it was kind of neat. Both my mom and my dad, after me coming out, after being a minister, my mom told a reporter once, "It's so nice to be an atheist now. I don't have to hate anymore, you know? I don't have to hate anybody. I can just accept people for who they are." And so she died as an atheist, and everybody knew, but at the graveside, there were religious relatives there. And so how do you handle that? And my mom would not have wanted to upset the religious relatives. She wouldn't have wanted atheism down their throats. And yet, when you go to religious funerals, what do you get, right? How many of you sat through religious funerals to hear this stuff, you know? I wrote a song for my mom, but she died before she got to hear it. I was almost tempted to play it, but I thought, wait a minute. What I basically said, and Dad asked me to say some things, and that was really hard to do, because he could hardly even talk. But I said, Mom, my mom, and everybody knew her, she was a loving, generous person. My mom did not believe in life after death. My mom believed in life before death. And she does live on, but not in any conscious sense. She lives on in the memories of those who remain, and she will always live on in our memories. And she lives on in the lingering effects of any deeds that she did during her life. Anything that she did will continue. And so in a natural sense, Mom lives on. And that was a respectful way without insulting, although there was some grumbling from some family members who were really upset that I and Mom and Dad and my brother Daryl, we both became atheists after a lifetime of being ministers and being Christians. So there's the story of Charles Bradlaugh in England. He was elected to Parliament, but they wouldn't seat him because he was an atheist. And when his son died, Charles Bradlaugh his son was young. He stood at the graveside and he said, "I understand the temptation. I can see it, the desire to wish that I'm going to see my son again. I understand that. That's just natural. You love somebody and they're in your heart and your mind, and it's unthinkable that they're actually gone, you know." But he said, "I'm not going to sacrifice reason on the altar of wishful thinking and the altar of emotion. We might want it to be that way." And I think that the fact that life is brief, the fact that we die, as Abby talked about during her talk, we're all going to die, that fact actually enhances the value of life. Because don't we give more value to things that are rare, precious metals, things that are not so plentiful have a higher price on them. If life is eternal, then life is cheap. The fact that life is brief and short and precious is what makes it all the more valuable. I think we atheists really have a higher value on life than believers who think, oh, well, whatever I do now is just a tiny blip in eternity. This life really isn't that important. It's a stepping stool. It's a way to get into heaven or to avoid hell, so I'm going to be living forever in an eternity. Yeah, which to me isn't life. Life is struggle. Life is solving problems. Life is dealing with pain and moral dilemmas. And in eternity where there's none of that, that's not life. That would be an eternal death to me. So all of our families are different. Only you know how to relate to your relatives and only you know what would be the right thing to say in that situation. But I don't think we atheists have to back off from value or from talking about life and death.
I can actually tell a story about some friends of mine. Their son was killed in action in Iraq, and he was a very young man in his 20s. And they were, of course, visited by clergy of every stripe. And they were actually fairly offended by the people who said, "Oh, we know that he's in heaven now, and aren't you happy? You know your son is in heaven." No, they weren't happy. Their son was dead. And there was a humanist celebrant who came to them and said, "We'll be with you every step of the way. You don't want to be here, I don't want to be here, but we are here and we will stick with you throughout this." That family went to the humanists. So there is some real power in this.
Thank you, and thank you to our speakers. Appreciate it. That concludes Dawn on the Blues 2014. Thanks for coming out, and hopefully we'll see some of you at the social afterward at One World Cafe. Thank you very much for coming.